It's Tam, and welcome to the art review of all my work from 2022. So I wanted to take a minute to reflect back on the year, all the work I've done, the progress I've made, how I felt about each piece, and just the things I learned on my way. I think it's kind of interesting for you all to see not only the work I've done, but what I've learned from it and where my mental space was throughout the year. Because there were some points where art was very frustrating, and there's some points where art was actually very fun. And I think that's something that is good for people who do want to get more into art to see, to know that, you know, if you're a little frustrated with it, you're not alone, and it comes and goes, it's gonna be okay. So with that, let's get on to the artwork. Here's my first painting. It's Death of the Raven. Very cool name because it's just a raven skull. It's nothing too fancy, but I put a little rose in it to make it look nice. This was in January, and this is a finished painting. And it's important to note that while this is a very strong start to the year, I actually really like this painting a lot for a lot of reasons. This is the culmination of a lot of efforts from the past year, a couple months of working up to this. So this is not something I just did immediately in January. So keep that in mind with this. It took a lot of effort to get to here. And really one of the most interesting parts about this is when I really started to learn a lot about how to use edges in painting, and what would require a harder edge, what would require a softer edge. And also this is where I learned a lot about lighting. This is the first time I really looked into what Lambert's immersion law was. Lambert's emission law, I think it is. Which is a really interesting concept with painting because it shows you how much stronger all the highlights are compared to the shadows. A lot of the details actually in the shadows are where the form turns, because the lit areas are so bright, and that's why you can see here that those value ranges for the light are so closely grouped together. And once I started doing that, everything started to look much more realistic. So definitely look into that. I'll link the video that I learned it from, which is a video on the Proco channel by Dorian Aten. Dorian Aten, he knows what he's talking about. So definitely look into his stuff. He has a lot of stuff for free on his site. Just go in there. His modeling factor videos are excellent, absolutely excellent. And it's crazy. Once you find good resources for learning art, it's incredible how much more efficient you can learn it. There's some people putting out some really great content that summarize it really well, but it's hard to find sometimes because there's so much content out there that's not great. So if you're in that space, you're trying to learn art, but you're having trouble finding good resources for it, I made a blog post, which I'll link as well. You can go into there, see the resources I use to learn art, and some that I recommend. Also, a lot of those resources are recommended by pretty much every artist out there that actually is good. So definitely check that out. Other than that, this piece really gave me some high spirits going into the year. It was a big success for me, a big level up in my art career and art skill set. And it just really set the tone for the year that kind of carried me through some of the more difficult times, as we'll see coming up. Next up is Ghosty Cats. This is also in January. This is a sketch. It's not really a finished piece at all. It's just something that I was coming up with. A lot of times I will sit down and just doodle a lot of different ideas and concepts, especially when I'm working on illustrations that I'm going to eventually turn into a cross-stitch design. And this is one of those cases where it just was something that came out of one of those sessions that I really liked. You can see a little bit at the top, there's some more sketchy stuff that I cut out, and that's usually what happens on a sheet. I'll just have tons of different little idea doodles, little thumbnails, things like that. Most of them aren't great. That's kind of the process though, is you kind of have to say, oh, I think I have an idea, I'm gonna put something down, and you kind of see how it works out visually. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes it feels like it should be cool, but when you put it on a page, you realize it just doesn't work visually. There's just something in there that's not working. I think this one has a lot of promise, so I put this in here. And really, the thing that struck me about this piece is that learning more about the fundamentals, it was interesting how quickly, if if I had a good idea, I could really get something that read pretty clearly, pretty quickly. I mean, this whole thing took maybe like 10 minutes tops, which for me is kind of a big deal because a lot of times art takes a long time, but learning more of the fundamentals really sped it up. So, and then I use this idea too later. I haven't actually worked with this sketch fully. I haven't taken this concept and really expanded it into like an original illustration yet. Something I want to do. I like the concept a lot, but I did use this concept in a later painting, which we will get to. It's a little bit different than this, but it's got a lot of these ideas in it. Next up is the study of this shelf here, and this is an important piece for the year. It doesn't look very important, it doesn't look very flashy, it doesn't look very good, but this was a very important one because this shelf, I did this all from my own understanding of form and light. I didn't really use any references. Normally I would, just to really speed up the process and make sure I get things right the first time. Even if usually I don't copy from the reference, but I'll use it to figure out like what's the form of this look like, how is the material look, how is the reflectivity, how is some of the detailing done. I didn't do any of that for this one, and not because it's better to do that way, but more so this was a study to really challenge my understanding of perspective and light and how it works. And there were some real good successes on this, and there were some places that were not as successful that really taught me, hey, this is where you need to start focusing because you can do some of these things right and you can't do some of the other things right. So one thing that was very good about this was the perspective. I was able to do all this in perspective, laid it all out, even with that red bottle, which is actually rotated around to a different sort of perspective. This piece actually taught me to really look into how to rotate planes in perspective, which I actually made a GIF about. I'll link it above as well. I did like a Reddit post with a GIF and everything, and people really liked it. So that GIF was actually born out of me working on this piece and not understanding how to rotate that bottle properly. So technically this bottle is rotated a little bit improperly, but also shows that if you get it close, it's usually fine with the perspective as well. Other than that, there's some really interesting things I did with the light here, especially with some of the balls being slightly see-through. I think the bottle of the black ink really worked well. That was probably the most successful part of this piece, the red ink being number 2. And I can tell you now that I've dug more into how light works, there's a lot of mistakes about how the light works on this painting. There's a lot of cool things I did too, like you can see the red behind the bottle on the back of the shelf. It's got some, color tone on it and everything. It's not the most majestic piece. There's definitely a lot of errors in it. It's not detailed out. There's not a lot of stuff going for it in terms of composition, but that's not stuff I was really focusing on. I was really trying to test my skills and see where I was lacking and where I was doing stuff right. So I'd really recommend, if you haven't done this before, just every once in a while, test your skills, see what you can do. And if something is wrong or incorrect, don't worry, it's okay. It just shows you where you need to start focusing with your learning. And it's a really great way to get much more efficient with your art because you'll be able to tell which parts you need to start working on. And that's what this was here for me. There were some parts about this that I was getting a little frustrated on, so I would take a break and I'd come back to it. I think I did this in like 3 sessions. And it also taught me that I can be frustrated at some parts, and that's okay too. So overall, this really was a big deal for me, getting through this piece. It's not an exciting piece, it's not really flashy or beautiful, but it really set a turning point for the year in terms of my art, where I could say, now I'm at this level, here's what I need to work on, and then now let's move forward from there. So I'd recommend you all do something like that every once in a while. It's not terribly fun. It wasn't a fun painting to do, but it helped me so much for the year. Next up, the very originally named Death of a Raven, which is basically, it's just the same painting I had before, and I just did a border around it. And I wanted to call this out separately because the first part of this painting was so important to the beginning of this year and setting the tone off right. And I followed that up with creating a border around this because the idea behind this piece was to make it a cross-stitch design. From the get-go, that's what I wanted to do. So I wanted to do some sort of round border. I've seen a lot of cross-stitch designs really utilize that look. A lot of the cross-stitching is done on round hoops rather than like a square hoop. So having a circular design makes a lot of sense for that medium, I guess you can say. So that was always the plan, was to do some sort of border and try that out and see how that worked. I eventually did turn this into a cross-stitch design. I don't have that on here because they don't really look very flashy. And at the end of the day, it's mostly just clicking buttons to make something work in a different medium. It's nothing really original once you have the painting already complete and the pixel art already complete. But I'll show a little bit of some pixel art later with this one. But this one is not anything too interesting to talk about. I will say though, when I was painting these roses, I did find a method that really worked for me, especially you can see it on that top right rose, where what I did was I would put in the base tone, then I would kind of select off the shadow area, put that in with some nice soft gradients in there, and then I would kind of work the shadows in with that selection, and then I would pop out, put another kind of the base color again with like a very soft airbrush to kind of knock the shadows back a bit, and then I would go in with a hard edged brush and really kind of carve out the rest of that form. So that ended up being a very efficient way to go about and knock in all of these roses. The roses were a little bit challenging. Some of them were more successful than others, like the rose on the bottom, not that great. Still at this point, I didn't really work into how to handle the light yet for these pieces. This is something I learned much further along, actually really just last month. So you're going to see that there are going to be some mistakes with the light and the shadow in a lot of these pieces, especially if you look at like the cast shadows on the skull in the middle. It's not quite right. It's good enough, I think, for what it is. Most people aren't really going to know, but for me now, I'm like, okay, there's clearly some problems here. I didn't really, work this out like I should have. So, but at the end of the day, it was still fun, and this really kind of pushed my momentum forward still. And that's important. Sometimes it's good to have something a little easier if you need some more momentum with your art, because it can be very challenging and frustrating sometimes, especially when you're trying to push yourself. So this was definitely a big win for me. I really like how it turned out overall. The painting is not terribly special, but it didn't need to be, because remember the end result was to move it to a cross stitch. So going into the pixel art means you're going to lose a lot of the detail anyways, so I didn't really bother to detail this one out super hard, but I still think it looks pretty good. And now we are back to some more of this Raven skull. I've been getting a lot of use out of this painting from the first month. We're still in February here, so we're still early in. Still a lot of momentum, feeling really good about all my stuff this year. And this is what it looks like when I start taking a painting and moving it towards a cross stitch. Usually what I do is I'll take a painting, I'll then make a pixel art of it with the DMC thread colors, which means I'm using colors that map directly to a thread color in the real world here. And that way, all I have to do with the cross stitch program is then convert that pixel art into a cross stitch design. The reason why I take so many steps to get there is because cross stitch design programs are very annoying to use. They do really good stuff when it comes to like exporting everything and wrapping it up nicely and making it something easy to follow for someone who is stitching it, but actually plugging in all of these colors into there, it's slow, it's laggy. The actual user experience on these are usually pretty terrible. They're kind of low level. So I try to be in them as little as possible. So I try to front load all the work. Pixel art programs these days tend to be very good, actually. And so I usually use the pixel art programs to do the bulk of the actual conversion from a painting to a cross-stitch design. So that is what you're seeing here. That's the middle step. This is from a pixel art program. I think it turned out pretty well. There's a lot that I wanted to do with this that I couldn't because the thread colors were just difficult to work around with the painting, especially when you talk about shadows. Thread color usually doesn't get very dark unless you go with just black, but there's not much around a black thread that's similar in value. So you can see a lot of the shadows in here are much heightened, much brighter, and which is something you can work around. And I kind of did for the most part here. I used a lot of colored tones, especially in the shadows. And I brought in some of the red, which actually was the underpainting. I did like a little underpainting with red in this one. I don't know why, I just felt like it. And that kind of came through in the painting, and I wanted to push that a little bit with the cross stitch because it gave me more tones to work with. And that's what you see here. So at the end of the day, it's still pretty fun. It's a little bit more relaxing than coming up with your original painting, but it also doesn't feel as, it's not as fun when you're done. So good for when your brain's a little fried. It's usually I'll be working on these late at night where I just don't have the brain capacity to do something original. And I think it turned out great. So now we're in March. We're talking about more Raven Skulls. My visual library is so small. It's so incredibly small. I have no idea what anything looks like on like an active basis. And I figured out how to draw a Raven Skull. You're gonna see a lot of those this year because once you go through the process of really learning what the form is and how to, you know, show it in rotation and all this stuff, it's tough to want to do something original outside of that because it's so much work to learn all the form and everything and expand your visual library. So what I did was I just kind of coasted on the fact I learned this new object and all the form of it and the details of it and how it worked. And I just did a bunch of stuff with that one object, which is actually very fun. Definitely interesting to see how much easier it is to do with something that you know versus something you don't when you're drawing. So visual library, one thing, once you get the fundamentals down, you still need to build that visual library even if you have the fundamentals. And that's something I started working on more later into the year. But at this point, you're still gonna see a lot of Raven Skulls, so buckle up. We got a lot more of those to go. This one I actually did something interesting with Procreate. I started using the pencils in there for sketching. They actually do have some really good pencil brushes. I was still trying to get used to them in this one, and there's definitely some mistakes on here, especially that Raven Skull in the middle. It's just the form is not quite right on it, but it's close enough to, you know, get across what I was trying to do. And I think this one I started making it into a cross stitch design, and I stopped because I wasn't happy with it. I just don't think it's strong enough of a design, but it ended up being something interesting to work on, and I did learn some throughout the year too. So still pretty happy with that, but there's, you know, more of these to come. And here is another one. This is still in March. I think this might even been on the same sheet as the other Raven Skull trio we just looked at. So like I said, I tend to do whole sheets of these where I just do bunches of different designs. And this one is, I was playing a lot of Diablo 3. This is before all the Blizzard crap came out. But at that point I was still doing a lot of Diablo stuff. I actually got one of the Diablo art books, which I thought was really awesome. And so this kind of has that Witch Doctor Diablo 3 vibe with a Raven Skull charm. Although I will say, if this was going to be a charm, this would be a very tiny skull. So it doesn't really quite translate, and it doesn't really work in the real world. But I think this is such a cool look, especially with those pencil brushes. It has just like a quick, you know, quick, dirty, sketchy vibe to it that really adds to kind of the brutalness of it. And this is one that I learned something very interesting with this because I love this design so much. I tried to pixel art it to create a cross-stitch design with it, and found out that a lot of the times with these pencil brushes in Procreate, they don't translate to a painting very well. You have to really work it a lot to get there, and especially not to a pixel art because there's so much detail in all the strokes and texture. So I do still enjoy using those pencil brushes to sketch, but I did learn that you need to have an intermediary step where you take that sketch and make a painting on it if you actually want to make a full-on cross-stitch design. So that was something I learned here too. And now we are still in March, but we're having a bit of a turn here. This is a big painting for my year, and it's not because it was good. This was a little fan art I did. You know, Elden Ring came out. I really love the game. I love some of the visuals of it and the tones of it and things like that. I'm a big fan of the FromSoft games. And So I attempted to do a fan art. This was actually from an in-game screenshot. So I actually had a direct reference for this, and I could not for the life of me figure out how to get this painting to work. I tried repainting it multiple times, and I'm still not happy with it at all. I actually was tempted not to even put this into the review because I was so unhappy with it, but it is a very important turning point of the year. This is when I started to get pretty frustrated with art. I'm realizing that I thought I leveled up a ton with my art knowledge, especially with some of the fundamentals and the work I've been doing. And this is when it took me a while to really realize this, but this is when my skills showed me that, hey, you still actually have a lot you need to learn and work on. Even though you're making some stuff that is really good and you're doing things much more efficiently, you're still not quite at the level where you can just whip out Procreate and draw anything. So, and this was a tough learning process for me here because I really felt like I could do something really good with this, and I struggled with it very heavily. I've since learned that there's a lot of mistakes in here, especially with how the light works. I didn't really understand how to plot out the light in a scene like that in perspective, and there's just so much of this painting that it's just struggled because I didn't really know how light worked. So something that really should have been easy turned out to very much not be, and be very difficult. It was very frustrating. I didn't know why it didn't look good. And one of the things I loved about learning the fundamentals is when I saw something that I did that didn't look good, I can then think and say, okay, I know why now that doesn't look good, and I know how to fix it. And so having this happen and not knowing why it looked bad was very demoralizing for me, and it was something that really set me back. I wasn't very happy with it, and I felt pretty bad for a while. And it's something that stuck with me for many months. And I had to figure out a way of how to handle that while keeping up with my art, because art is something I want to be a big part of my life. So it can be tough when that happens sometimes. And you're going to see in these next ones how I kind of dealt with that throughout the year and how I brought myself back. Because I will say now, at the end of the year, I feel quite good about things now. So I did figure out how to handle it. So let's move into some others and talk about how I did that. This is the pixel art of the Raven Skull Trio, still in March. So one thing I ended up doing to kind of deal with the fact of the last piece that was so demoralizing is just to go into some easy stuff. And this is where I took some of my old sketches and I just went and made some pixel arts of them. It's pretty easy to do. And it's kind of brainless to do it for the most part. There's some things you have to think about in terms of, like, you know, what are you going to do for colors and how to plot it and how to take complex forms and break them down to more simple shapes. But overall, it's not too difficult, and this is a way I've learned how to deal with demoralizing art failures, especially when you're pushing yourself, even if you don't realize it, is to just go back and do some stuff that's easy that you'll know will make you feel a bit more accomplished, to kind of build back up some of the momentum again and get your confidence back. On the topic of that, now we're in June, and this is a bit of a break from the last one I did. I did a number of like little sketches and stuff in between these, nothing really good enough to really post here as like finished sketches or finished pieces, but I took some time. I took a couple months to really slow down on things, just work some easy stuff, make some interesting little sketches, try to build my confidence back. And this sketch right here is just one I did from imagination. I was just outside, sketching outside of my sketchbook, just doing something from imagination, not trying to make anything look great, just kind of having fun playing with the organic forms of a tree and just kind of making it warp around and do interesting things. At the end of the day, nothing on this really is terribly good. It's not a piece that's like composed well. It's not one that has like great detail, but the interesting thing is I was able to sit down and just have fun breaking out some forms on here and just doing some very light perspective, having fun with a ballpoint pen and not really dwell on it too much. And this is an important point because at this point I'm just having fun with art again. After being demoralized for a couple months, struggling, not understanding what I'm doing wrong with my art, when I was doing stuff that looked so good before and now it doesn't, and why that is. That can take some time to really kind of work through it and figure out. So this is another turning point of the year of being able to sit down, just enjoy doodling something, you know? It's not the most beautiful piece, but it's something that I feel is very successful. There's a lot of points in here that I actually do really like, especially like the top part of the tree that I didn't finish out. I love how I kind of handled the hatching around there to really build the form up. And yeah, it's an important point is when you get demoralized, sometimes you do have to take a step back and do stuff a little bit easier, get your confidence back and really be able to hop back into it. And hop back into it I did, because this is still in June, and this is a finished painting. I called it Goth Flowers. They're not really flowers, they're just leaves of plants that I assume grow flowers. I don't even know if this is a real plant. I wanted to do, there's a lot of plants out there with they have like purple and black leaves. I thought that was very cool. And one thing I realized with especially the Elden Ring fan art is I was having trouble putting in details into my paintings and really rendering them out. So what I wanted to do was sit back and do a very detail heavy painting, and I wanted to make it simpler on myself. So I did things on here like I took the perspective completely off. I'm looking straight down at some leaves of some plants, and while there is a little bit of perspective in here, it's definitely nothing too difficult. It's not like I'm doing architecture or something where I really need to lay everything out properly. This one was definitely about, let's figure out how to make something read. Let's figure out how to put some more detail into this. You'll see a lot of these flowers have different or a lot of these leaves, I should say, have a lot of different methods of trying to add detail and finish them out. And I was really playing around with like different brushes, different approaches, figure out what felt good to me. And I felt like this is a very successful piece. It's not terribly flashy. It's kind of more of a background imagery, honestly. And really, it also is more of a study than a full painting in terms of like an illustration. So I think this is really successful. I worked a long time on this. I think, you know, maybe a whole month on actually finishing this out. It was a lot of detail work, and detail work is something that I have not been very good at in the past. I find I struggle with sitting down and for a couple hours and really just working on some repetitive detailing. And these days now, after going through this, I can say, okay, now I know really when I'm working on my art, at what points am I really crafting the scene and putting the form in and the shapes and the light and the underlying structure of it, and at what point am I just putting details on top of that. And this is a very helpful painting for me to figure that out. And I gotta say, I'm not really a fan of putting a bunch of details on, but I've gotten better at it, I've gotten more efficient at it, and I forced myself to learn some of the efficiencies by working on this piece. I feel like that was actually very successful. And because of that, it really gave myself a lot of momentum going into the second half of the year here. Having a good success halfway through really was nice, especially how demoralizing I was before I got to this. Now we're into July, and this time I did a fan art of a cover of a band that I actually have really enjoyed this year called Ghost. And they have a bunch of really fun characters. And I said to myself, okay, now that I'm working on detailing stuff and I've learned a lot, one thing that I know that I have a big weakness in is figure drawing and figuring out the form of a person and drawing it accurately so that it feels like an actual person. And so what I did was I spent a little bit of money to get Marco Bucci's Understanding and Paying the Head series, which actually turned out to be fantastic. Highly recommend it, especially if you know your fundamentals, because what he does is he doesn't tell you how form works, he doesn't tell you how light works, he just shows you the specifics of the form of the head, which for me was exactly what I needed. I just needed someone to tell me, like, what does this actually look like? What is the different parts of it, and how does it read in 3D, so that you can draw that in any rotation however you want. So if you do know the fundamentals and you're still trying to expand your visual library, highly recommend it. If you don't know your fundamentals, you're probably not going to get as much out of it as you think. So keep that in mind if you are interested in looking for that, and I'll link it as well. But this is actually a fan art. This is actually a direct copy from a photo. I took some liberties with it, but at the end of the day, I did have a very solid reference for it, which I needed because I didn't really know the form of figure drawing that well. I've done figure drawing in the past. I do know quite a bit of the anatomy that's going into it, but especially when we talk about like the face, which there are quite a few inconsistencies and problems on this face here. It doesn't look quite right, but it looked close enough that I thought it was acceptable for my skill level. But I needed a very strong reference to be able to figure out how to do this, so which I got, and I felt like this is a very successful painting. I posted on Reddit. It seemed to get a really good response from people. They actually really liked it, and that made me feel pretty good. It really, once again, trying to build some confidence, working directly from a photo, not just from my own knowledge. That really helped me get something that looked a little bit better, right? A little bit less difficult, which helps you just build that confidence up. So that's really what the goal with this was. And because I had that reference, I was able to take some risks on the painting itself in terms of like the strokes I used, the brushes I used, which I actually took that knowledge and applied it to some other pieces I've done since. So it was very helpful to go back and do something that was easier on one side so that I could do harder stuff on another, and then just increase my skill overall. September. This one I did a quick painting here. I call it Skeletal Hand. It's nothing too special. I had an idea. I saw another piece of art that looked very cool that had a similar concept to this, and the idea is a skeletal hand holding a bouquet of something that reads as a skull. And I feel like this is not my best painting ever, but I am including this here. So the idea of this was to turn this into a cross-stitch design, which I did pixel art it, but I don't think I'm happy enough with the concept yet, how I visually executed it, to really finish it out as a cross-stitch. I might revisit this one and try some, different ways around it, because I feel like it's very flat. But overall, I'm really happy with this painting because of how incredibly quickly I was able to get this to read the way I wanted it to, especially that kind of skeletal hand. Bones, especially in the hand, can be very difficult because they're very tiny, intricate. There's a lot of them. They have very special, very specific places they need to be in order to look right. I feel like this one was fairly successful, and I really just used like 3 tones for the skeletal hand, and it just was put on the canvas so quickly and easily for me. It really showed a lot of the progress I've made in terms of understanding the form and the light and local tone, local color, and all that stuff. The fact that I could just put stuff in once and have it look good is a huge efficiency boost, which means I could just work on so much more work throughout the year and do more art and different art. And the only reason I got here is because I took a step back and slowed down and made sure I found out how to do things correctly first. And now I'm really starting to see some of those efficiencies creep back in now that I'm getting all those knowledge under my hand and figuring out how to do it. Now we're skipping forward to the end of the year. We're now in November. I'm wrapping this all up in December, so early December. So this is really the last month where I did anything notable for art this year that I'm going to review for this actual video. This one I called it Their Friendship. So I have 2 cats. Well, I should say we have 2 cats, me and my partner. And one of them is a black cat named Smidge, and one of them is a calico, brown white cat named Mako. And I wanted to do a piece of art with the 2 of them. I was reading a book about a number of different things, but one of the things they touched about was other people's perception of you, and thinking about if you were looking at yourself from the outside and saying, who is that person? And saying, is that the kind of person you want to be, right? I realized that while I feel like I'm doing art and I really want to be an artist, it's hard for people who don't know about art to really interact with my work, because they might say, oh, that looks good, but they just don't have the knowledge to know how good it is, right? And I'm not quite at the point where I look like a professional artist yet in terms of my work. It's getting a lot better. I'm not quite there yet though. So one of the things I decided was, hey, I should try to make art to submit to competitions, small competitions, things like that. You might pay like $30. It's for like a magazine or something. There's no like job payout or anything like that. It's not one of those scammy ones. Just something where everyone puts some stuff in and they give some awards out. They might give some cash to the top. Nothing really too crazy there. But I felt like having something tangible there that someone who doesn't know art to interact with. So say if I won one of those, I could say, hey, I was the winner of the 2022 blah, blah, blah. Someone who doesn't know art would actually understand that is an award and that is a competition. They could look it up maybe, but they would be able to tell like, oh, Tam actually knows how to do art. And it's something I want in my life to be able to show people and be like, hey, I actually am good. You might not understand why, but here's something that you can understand so that you understand how, I am an artist and how it's important to me. So the next two paintings are ones that I built for competition. This one I built, I felt really good about it. I really did. This is an interesting one on a number of different ways because I started it from the ground up in terms of playing with elements of design and art. The whole concept of this, I saw another painting of koi fish that kind of had shapes bleed into being koi fish from like the top down, and I like the idea of having just abstract goo and then having forms kind of cut in from that goo. And that's what I did here is I took some soft texture brushes, laid them out with different colors, and just tried to get something on the page that was really abstract, that kind of played with some of those fundamentals of design. And then I took that and I carved out my cats from it, so they kind of slowly bleed into cats. And it has a lot to do with the koi fish paintings that you see a lot of times, so definitely very reminiscent of that. If you caught that when looking at this, that's good. That means that it actually read properly. And I really did feel good about this. This one I painted very large as well. And it's one that I'm printing out as a poster for my own place as well. So really felt good about that. Unfortunately, the competition I painted this for, I found out was a no digital art competition. And it was very clearly stated. I don't know how I missed it. I just must have been rushing through reading the description. So that really was on me. But at the end of the day, I still got an awesome painting out of it. And I was very happy with that. And it was nice to have a deadline to get something done by, because it forced me to actually work on it and finish it all the way through. Not just, get a sketch down, feel good about it, and then be like, oh, I'll learn how to detail paintings out later. This one actually forced me to go in and detail it out, which I felt, mixed success, but overall pretty successful how this ended up. And here we are with the last painting on this list for my art review in 2022. We're still in November, because December I'm probably going to include in next year's art review. I'm going to probably do these in December. And this one was also for a competition, one that I actually read the rules on and knew that it was okay to post, so that was good. I learned a lot with that. The unfortunate thing is this one I needed to have done in 3 days. And I really wanted to submit something to a competition this year to really see how it worked. And I was able to successfully submit this, which is good. However, I feel like this is not the strongest painting. One thing that is interesting about it is this is all from my imagination. Now, there were references used to like, here's what rocks look like, here's what turtles look like, here's what moss looks like, here's what rivers look like. But in terms of actually copying this from a photo, this is all my original perspective. I put a perspective grid in, I laid out some forms, I started, figuring out what's going to be in light, what's in shadow, and went in to try to detail it from there. So this river and these rocks don't exist anywhere. They're just completely my creation. Because of that, I'm missing out on quite a bit of realism with this piece, because I realized working on it, I am missing, number one, how to detail some of these forms out, how to detail some of these objects out, but also number two, I didn't really understand how to light a scene. You can see in this, it's got a very flat light. Part of that's by design, because I'm thinking it's an overcast day, right? So we're talking about no direct light. We're talking about mostly just a flood of ambient light from the skylight. So that's why, one of the reasons why it looks very flat, but also I realize I understand how to handle light in a scene. I understand how to light my own scene. And that definitely took away a lot of the impact and realism of this piece. It made it feel much flatter than it needed to be. So while I was very happy with this piece, because this definitely showed a lot of growth from the beginning of this year till now, a ton of growth. I could not do this in January. I would not have been able to. But at the same time, I still wasn't happy with it. Of course, the one good thing about that is I was unhappy with it, but I was actually able to see why. And that's the most important thing I think about the fundamentals, is it doesn't make art confusing when it doesn't look right. It just makes you step back and say, okay, why is this not looking right? And then you can find out, oh, it's because of this, and then work on that. And that is so much less annoying than just being confused and unsure of why your stuff doesn't look good. I hated that feeling. It made me quit art for years, and when I came back, it was one of the that was the first step I worked on in terms of learning art again, was how do you get rid of that feeling of confusion? I hate it. It drives me insane. And so I'm glad that that didn't happen on this piece like it did with the Elden Ring piece. Because of that, I actually went in and started learning more about light. I've been working through Scott Robertson's How to Render book, which goes into a lot about how light works. Really fantastic book, highly recommended. If you do, definitely do the actual doodles he does in there. Like, actually go through and do your own version of those workups that he does, those lessons, because that's going to teach you so much about how it works. Even if it seems reasonable when you just read through it, make sure every single one go through and do the same thing he's doing, because it teaches you so much. I've already learned so much about how light works, and my art from this point onwards, I've done a couple things in December already, and they're just miles ahead of what this was. So highly, highly recommended. And from there, we're just talking about looking forward. What am I going to do in the new year? What are my plans? What are my goals? What am I trying to do to improve my art and move forward? I have improved so much from the start of the year till now. I'm very happy with that growth, and I want to continue it into this new year. So because I want to get my skills up a little bit before I start working again, like I said before, I'm working through Scott Robertson's How to Render book. I think that is going to shore up a lot of my weaknesses with art, which is how light works, how to detail things out properly, and also how to draw things right the first time without having to redo them over and over and over, because that really kills your efficiency. Another thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to build my visual library. Like I said with the Raven Skull before, I learned how to draw it, and I just only drew that because that's all I knew. I don't really know what things work. I have a very limited visual library. Because of that, I wanted to get better at it. So what I actually ended up doing is building a blog. I know that sounds completely outside of what art is, but the whole goal of that was to give myself somewhere that forces me to sit down and actually write what I learn out, especially when it comes to visual library. I'll actually link one of my blog posts. It's about how to draw sharks, and it forced me to sit down and really learn what is the form of sharks, how do they act, how do they work, what's the colors, how does the anatomy work, and just figuring out that, so now I can draw a shark in really any scene I want, because I took the time to really learn it. And by writing out a blog post about that to share to you all as well, it forced me to really sit down and learn it. And that's been one of the best parts about this blog, is it really forces me to sit down and work all the way through it. Not just guessing at it, not just getting most of it. I have to really learn it, because if you want to teach it, you really have to learn it. So that's what I'm working on going forward. I'm going on learning some more fundamentals. I'm working on expanding my visual library. And I'm also going to be working on making more YouTube videos. That's one thing that I didn't do as much this last year. The blog is going to help, because it's going to force me to write out video scripts, essentially. Like this video, which I wrote the blog post maybe a month before I got to this video, made it a lot easier to record. I knew what I was going to say and everything. And I'm planning on using some of that blog content to then also make YouTube videos out as well. On top of that, I want to expand the cross-stitch designs. I want to get up to 10 designs. That was the goal this year. Totally failed it, but that's okay, because I learned so much about art that I'm going to be able to work so much more efficiently in the new year anyways. So that's really what I'm focusing on, those 4 areas. I'm focusing on learning fundamentals, expanding my visual library, making interesting blog content that is about those first 2 parts of the year that I'm going to be working on. And then the 4th one is really expanding my original illustrations and moving those into a commercial space, because I find that's actually very fun and fulfilling for me. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'm going to link all of the things I talked about in the description. They should also be in the video under those like little links in the top. And let me know if you have any comments or questions on any of this stuff. If you are trying to work through your art journey and you're finding stumbling blocks, feel free to reach out to me. I can definitely point you towards some references and resources that were helpful to me. And I hope you too also take some time and look back on your art for the year and reflect, because it's so helpful and it really makes you feel good to see how you move forward. Because I have to say, before I did this, I didn't really think that I improved that much, but looking back, I really did. So I hope you all see a similar result from your reviews as well, and feel free to link me to any of them if you want my comments. I'd be happy to look, and I hope that you all have a great 2023, and here's to some great art for all of us. Have a good one. Bye.